Hi, and welcome back to STS 1451. Our keywords, concepts, and names for today include pre-lab and post-lab, midwife, forceps, anesthesia, James Young Simpson, Robert Cook, Alexander Yersin, Kitasato, Shiba Saburo, and these asterisks, like previously, indicate names from the reading. So, alternatives to the timeline. I've criticized timelines, I've criticized linear narratives of progress, but we keep reading about change over time. So, you have to start to write your own paper about change over time pretty soon. What should you do? I want you to think about the timeline as a tool and try to be transparent about what it can and cannot express. Like we saw last time, it can make something like the invention of the microscope seem like it caused a change that really wouldn't have come about without other things like policy changes that made access to laboratories free. So you're going to have to make some decisions about how to tell your story. And if you just pay attention to those decisions and just be honest about where you're choosing to focus, you'll be able to do this responsibly. For example, we've read about the transition from the pre-lab to the post-lab identity of a disease. If you haven't read the Cunningham yet, that's what Cunningham's going to talk about. We have also read about the increased cultural credibility of the scientific model of medicine and the implied displacement of alternative forms of expertise. This is a quote from page 219 of Cunningham on pre-lab identity of the plague. How was plague identified? What was its identity before the advent of the laboratory? While it would be misleading to claim that there was just a single picture of plague before the lab, since every outbreak revealed much disagreement and conflict amongst practitioners over the nature and treatment of plague, yet the pre-lab identity of plague differed radically from its post-lab identity in a number of striking ways, which can be considered under two main heads. In the first place, like all other diseases, plague before the laboratory was always identified by its symptoms and its course. Primarily, this means it was identified by the presence of buboes. But pre-lab symptoms were many and complex, and even the buboes were not necessarily evident, nor were they even always taken to be the most important symptoms. Generally, as a late 18th century investigator noted, buboes and carbuncles are equally diagnostics of other diseases. When we think of the identity of a disease as specific manifestation of its symptoms, it makes sense that our approach to treatment would be therapeutics designed to address those symptoms. Bloodletting can make a rapid heart rate slow. You might lance a boil or a bubo in order to let it release its pus. On page 21, Cunningham cites Vivian Nutton, who makes a very similar point. The post-lab plague is entirely different. The way doctors think about it is completely different. When the new plague is conceived as a specific germ, your approach is universal. So instead of looking at the individual patient's symptoms and then just addressing that symptom, is their heart rate up? Do they have a fever? Do they have boils? Instead, you're going to try to kill that germ, and you're going to want to do the same thing in all of your patients. Universalism, according to Warner's terminology. In 2019 and 2020, we've seen some problems with the universalist approach to attacking COVID-19 since the symptoms present so differently. Remember, these changes were general trends. Universalism did not root out all applications of specificity. Remember what Cunningham says on page 238. Plague transformed. Thus, as we can see here in the case of plague, the coming of the laboratory created a watershed in the identity of infectious diseases. Indeed, one can be even more precise and actually specify the date on which they acquired new identities. For plague, it was the 14th to 24th of June, 1894. But in speaking of 1894 as a watershed in the definition of identity of plague, I do not wish to imply that everyone immediately in 1894 adopted this new bacteriologic, as I call it, understanding. We have already seen how difficult a way of thinking this was for Chinese officials to adopt, but it was also very difficult for Western medical men. So again, just because you have a scientific discovery doesn't mean that medicine changed right away. Just like we saw with the microscope, you need to convince people in order to have them all agree that it's a fact, and then you need policies to change, you need medical practices to change. It really takes a long time, and you always have a blend of old practices with the new. It's not just the new displacing the old. In other words, adopting the new model was difficult in multiple cultures, and it really took time. How do you get a post-lab diagnosis? So we might think that all you have to do is get some blood drawn, look under a microscope, but it's actually a really, really complicated process. And this is something Cunningham talks about in depth, so I really want you to pay attention. This is a diagram from page 214. So you get the clinical specimen, you remove some of the fluid from a bubo, you get sputum or blood culture, and you might get material from experimental animals inoculated with plague suspect material. So you first get these materials from an infected human, you then infect an animal, then you take it from the animal, then you smear it in a specific scientific process called the Wason stain. Then you isolate it using different media. He gives some examples of those media here: heart infusion agar, blood agar, etc. Then you look at suspicious colonies on that isolation media. So you get something to grow on a specific surface, and then you look at what's growing there and you study what's growing. Then gram-negative organisms are subcultured to bacteriophage test or heart infusion broth or all these different things. You might not understand all of the science of this. I know that in the middle here, there are definitely some steps that I don't understand and I could not replicate myself. But it's what happens when we get blood drawn. You know, the doctor doesn't look at it right there. He doesn't just put it on a slide and put it under a microscope. They have to mix it with different materials, isolate things, see how they react, see what grows in a petri dish or a culture. So it's actually really difficult to isolate that germ and figure out what's causing it. It was a big scientific breakthrough, and you could see why it would take a while to convince people, because it's not just empirically observable in an obvious way. You need people to believe that when you go through all of these processes, what you're finding is the truth that's inside the human body. That's actually a leap of faith that you have to take by understanding the science. You need to convince people. Cunningham says in 215, the term cause is being used here in a specific sense, the sense in which we mean that this bacillus, P. pestis, is the cause of plague as specified by what are known as Cook's postulates. In discussing the necessary and sufficient conditions that would have to be satisfied for a microorganism to be accepted as the direct cause of a particular disease, Robert Cook wrote that, quote, complete proof of the causal relationship demands not merely a demonstration of coincidence of the parasites with the disease, but beyond this, it must be shown that the parasites directly produce the disease. So you could take a bunch of samples and say, like, okay, everyone who's sick has this in their blood, but that's still, because correlation doesn't imply causation, that still doesn't prove that it's the cause until you do other things. No wonder Cunningham says that the post-lab identity is constructed. It takes a lot of work in order to figure out the cause of a disease in the bacteriologic model. Again, this isn't because I'm not saying that bacteria is causing disease. I'm just saying that it's not obvious. You need work, scientific knowledge, different practices, different tools, different policies in order to be able to see it as the cause. Cunningham and Warner both told change over time narratives, but remember that they're discussing trends and that these trends are not totalizing. There are still different therapeutics that look at the specifics of a patient body with emphasis on balance rather than on norms. So there are some alternatives to the timeline. Let's consider an example. Did the rise of scientific universalism, the post-lab view of science, and scientific medicine mean that other types of expertise like midwifery were completely abandoned or considered worthless? We can recognize that there is a general trend towards scientific medicine, but instead of just listing it, we can also think about how this happened. This is the irony of the historian of medicine. While we study a transition from specificity to universalism, we have to resist universalizing ourselves and look at specific subfields, specific patients. You know, we're going back and excavating illness narratives in order to understand illness from multiple perspectives at the same time. First of all, we have to recognize the fluidity of expertise. The categories of doctor and midwife inadequately describe the diversity in medical practice in Martha Ballard's 18th century town. Martha Ballard is a famous midwife now because her diaries still exist, so they have given historians a lot of insight into what a midwife's practice look like. Hallowell's doctors range from the eminently visible Dr. Daniel Coney, Justice of the Peace, representative of the General Court and founding president of the Kennebec Medical Association, to the anonymous Negro woman doctor who appears 2 or 3 times in the diary. So Ballard is working with a bunch of different medical practitioners. She's not just doing things by herself, and she names some people whose authority she finds more than others. Her use of this racial signifier here without naming the woman doctor tells us something too. There's a little bit of a gap in this knowledge. We know that there's a Black woman doctor, but we don't really know what she's practicing. And so it also helps us see that there's more than what the archives can tell us. That slide is funny. That means that midwives didn't have all the credibility, and physicians did have a relationship with patients even before there was a larger shift. The public was primed for a transition. So we've thought about the fluidity of expertise. There are different types of experts working together. They all have different relationships with patients. Now we can think about the power dynamics at stake. So let's think about gender, for example. How can expertise be gendered? Is the term midwife gendered? It seems like it probably is. This is a primary source from 1820 by Walter Channing from his remarks on the employment of females as practitioners in midwifery. The circumstances which would render females agreeable and most desirable as attendants in these cases are obvious to everyone. That obvious to everyone tells you that Walter Channing has a sense of who his audience is and who would be convinced by what. But the objections to their employment are of a nature not so immediately perceived, except by physicians and those conversant in the practice of midwifery. And since one side of the case, from its very nature, is clearly before the public and can and does have its influence, it seems right that the opposite should be so stated and explained as to have its fair counteracting operation and give the public an opportunity to judge impartially of the merits of the case. This appeal to judge impartially is an appeal to logos. It's a logical appeal. But he's also playing on our emotions by having us think, okay, maybe only physicians and experts, people with ethos, are going to be able to know what's the best for patients. He's trying to make us feel afraid. So logos, ethos, and pathos are all kind of working together in this passage. He goes on, I do not intend to imply any intellectual inferiority or incompetency in the sex of women. My objections are founded rather upon the nature of their moral qualities than the power of their minds, and upon those very qualities which render them in their appropriate sphere the pride, the ornament, and the blessing of mankind. So he's saying that women are an ornament. You could say that this is a pretty interesting argument here, that he's saying women are perhaps intellectually equal, but they're morally inferior. It's a little confusing, but definitely does not seem to be complementary to women. Women are distinguished for passive fortitude, firmness, etc., to a much greater degree than men. And this, whether they are called to endure suffering themselves or only witness it in others. They bear painful operations in surgery or witness them with a resolution at least equal to that of men. But this is all. Their virtues of this kind are wholly passive. They do not have the power of action or the active power of mind which is essential to the practice of a surgeon. They have less power of restraining and governing the natural tendency to sympathy and are more disposed to yield to the expressions of acute sensibility. All right, so now we're getting to see his biases even more. And these are biases that he's just assuming all of his readers are going to share with him. So he says women are really strong. They can deal with pain. They can even watch pain better than men. That stereotype might have changed by today's standards. But women just can't help but be sympathetic. And he's arguing that that's a bad thing. Like sympathy for your patient, sympathy for the woman in childbirth is a negative quality to have. This is the last slide of the primary source. The nature and progress of the mechanical part of simple natural labor can be easily explained and may be comprehended by the most limited understanding. Where then is the danger of trusting these cases, which form allowedly a very large proportion, to the hands of an intelligent and well-educated woman? I answer that it is wrong to look at labor as a mere mechanical process. It is a process in which every part of the system more or less partakes. So this is what we might call a straw man argument. Who says that giving birth to a baby is just a mechanical process? Surely no woman who's ever been in a birthing chamber, either as a midwife or a caretaker or giving birth. The local situation of the infant may be in every way favorable, and yet the mother may be dying from an infection of some other part of the system. No one can thoroughly understand the nature and treatment of labor who does not understand thoroughly the profession of medicine as a whole. So this is an argument that you need to be a medical doctor in order to help attend to patients. The way that he made his argument is by saying that women are too sympathetic and that they don't understand the whole body. They're not learning anatomy and physiology and the things that are starting to be taught as medicine starts to become more scientific. So why was Channing's attack on women midwives convincing to anyone? I'm going to leave that question open to debate. We've already talked a little bit about how he's making his logical appeals, who he thinks he's talking to. I'm going to let you guys draw your own conclusions. Some questions to consider from this primary source and what we've talked about so far. Do we want our medical experts to be objective and disinterested, like Channing says, or do we want them to be emotionally engaged? Although it might boil down to personal opinion, how do you think your opinion is shaped? Where did your ideas about your answer to that question come from? Channing appealed to this preference for disinterestedness and an emergent definition of professionalism in his case against midwives. What conditions would it take to make this neutral type of professionalism seem appealing? So what patients would appreciate a doctor who seems less sympathetic and more disinterested? What are the cultural conditions that make us think of that disinterest as more scientific and better for the patient? Again, I'm not going to answer that question for you. That's something I want you to consider. So back to the question of alternatives to the timeline. We can think about power dynamics. Sometimes they're gendered, sometimes they're racialized, sometimes they're interpersonal. Now let's think about the limitations of our categories. For example, is childbirth a pre-lab versus post-lab issue? Channing tries to make it seem that way. He says, we need to think about the whole understanding of the body through a scientific lens. He's saying that how we understand childbirth has changed as medicine becomes more scientific. But pre-lab and post-lab might not be the best terminology for understanding changes to childbirth. There's definitely a lot of laboratory components to childbirth now, especially in the US. You're going to have lots of ultrasounds, you're going to get lots of blood work done. They do a lot of laboratory things to make sure that the mother and the fetus are healthy. But pre-lab, post-lab seems like a clunky way to describe what's really going on there. It's really, really useful for understanding how the identity of the plague and other bacteriological infections work. But maybe we might need different terminology for understanding the shift in the field of obstetrics. So technology also played a role in the broader sea change of childbirth. And I already gave a few examples here, but I'm going to give a few major examples for why people started shifting from birthing chambers in their own house to the hospital in general. Again, some people still have home births. In the US and certainly around the world, home births are still a norm. Lots of healthy and happy babies are born that way. So why did the hospital, why did science become appealing to people in a Western context? What tools might have convinced patients to move from midwives to scientific medical practitioners, not in total, but in general? Forceps and anesthesia are two really important tools here. Both are flawed. So forceps were used to pull babies out if they got stuck, but they could harm the baby's head or they could injure the mother. So it helped with a baby who got stuck in the birth canal. And, C-sections were already around, but it's a really traumatic surgery. So if a forceps could be used, it is less invasive, but it's not perfect. And James Young Simpson introduced anesthesia in 1847, but ether and chloroform, the existing types of anesthetic, were fairly dangerous. After a constant process of change, safer anesthetics were eventually introduced. So once you have anesthesia, you start having women who want to use it in childbirth because of the intense pain. There were some women, of course, who still wanted to feel natural childbirth. Women still do want to experience that. There were men who thought women were supposed to feel the pain of childbirth for religious reasons. But one way or another, anesthesia, epidurals became a norm, and women started going to the hospital in order to receive anesthesia for childbirth. And midwifery continues to be an important medical practice in the US and all around the world. But we had a general sea change. As with the microscope, the newfound application of anesthesia did not imply its widespread use. This is an article about anesthesia for childbirth. Economic factors also shaped anesthesia practice. Finding and paying people to administer anesthesia for laboring women was a problem. In 1900, midwives were still not authorized to administer anesthesia, still helped many women deliver in the home. However, few newly built maternity hospitals had sufficient staff to provide this service. If you look into the different types of insurance that are needed by medical professionals, anesthesiologists need to pay really high insurance rates, because if they accidentally have a patient who has an adverse reaction or dies from anesthesia in childbirth or any situation, they need to be protected for that. So there are a lot of reasons why anesthesia, even though the idea of doing this with less pain could be appealing, still wouldn't just immediately take off. So we've had a general transition, but as I've said a few times, there are still many believers in natural childbirth today. And this is a story of general shift and not displacement. In a few days, when we watch Paralyzing Fear, we're going to see how the transition to hospital births had a devastating, unexpected consequence in the 20th century. But we're not getting to that until next week. So how do we define natural? How do we define healthy and ill? We talked about natural childbirth. We've talked about healthy mothers and babies. That question brings us back to the first strategy. Think about how different experts define these terms by analyzing primary sources. So what you define as natural, what you define as healthy, might be different from what a medical doctor defines as natural or healthy, or what a surgeon defines as natural or healthy, or a homeopathist defines as natural and healthy. And we just want to pay attention to all of these different perspectives, how they convince other people, and how they operate within medical culture at large. That's all for today. I hope that you enjoy your reading and that you're keeping up, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a good day.